energy sovereignty, I think, is the conversation that we really should have been having through the election. To some extent, I think we were having it. But the overemphasis on pipelines for their own sake misses the point that, well, we actually have pipelines. And the pipeline, what is it, $34 billion, I think, we shelled out.
Trans Mountain.
To get the Trans Mountain pipeline built. Where's that oil going?
California and China.
It's going to China in a very, very big way.
Welcome to Power Struggle. I'm your host, Stewart Muir. Today is Friday, April 25th, just 3 days before Canadians head to the polls in perhaps the most consequential election we've experienced in generations. By the time you listen to this episode, the results will have been decided. Canada will be starting a new political chapter. To reflect on where we are and where we might be headed, I'm joined today by renowned journalist and author Terry Glavin. Terry's incisive commentary has shaped Canadian political discourse for decades. Before diving into today's issues, I've asked Terry to read from his powerful 1990 book, A Death Feast in Dimlahamid. Terry, thanks for coming to Power Struggle. Here's your book. It was one of my favorite books.
Completely unexpected, and thank you very much, Stuart. We're geezers now, apparently.
Yes, officially.
And you wanted me to read, if I'm not mistaken,
right from the opening
of that chapter?
Chapter 4.
Okay.
Yes.
Here we go. Nola was the last chief to leave Dimlahamid. The seasons had turned back upon themselves and the city's final punishment began. The arc of the sun ended its northward migration and turned back again to the south. With each new morning, the snow line crept further down the mountainsides until the snow began to fall in the streets of Dimlahamid. The people of the great city had grown insolent and careless. They failed to honor the remains of the first returning salmon of spring. First, Garen mocked the sky with the first salmon running across the salmon weirs. The skies darkened and the snow fell, and it kept falling until all the great houses in Dimlahamid disappeared beneath it. There was Fanny Morrison's stone feast to be seen too. It was a gathering to feast for the raising of a headstone, a modern equivalent of a pole-raising feast. Fanny had died 20 years earlier, but her son Willie was never quite settled about his responsibilities in completing the cycle of fireweed feasts for her, and it had been bothering him all those years. And there was the feast for Lelt, the late Fred Johnson of Gitwangach, and there was another feast in Kispiox, the death feast for Mabel White, and there was much planning and arrangement to be done for the feast of Weesake's grandmother, Waiget, Elsie Morrison.
So 37 years ago.
God, I was a child reporter for the Vancouver Sun when I wrote that. Yeah. Yep. And strangely, it has echoes even now. Some things don't seem to change.
It's a timeless region and a consequential one. And there's so many passages here I would love to hear you read. That one, to me, speaks of the timelessness of the people of that part of the northwest of British Columbia.
Yeah.
Where is it on a map for someone?
Oh gosh. Well, if you're, I think most people are vaguely familiar with Prince Rupert, right?
Prince Rupert, yeah, almost Alaska.
Almost Alaska, and if you head up the Skeena River, I'm going to say maybe 100 miles, you get to the middle of the universe. You get to Dimlahamid, this ancient city-state that is said to have existed at the time, roughly at the forks. Where the Bulkley comes in. The Bulkley River comes into the Skeena. Very, very interesting part of the world. It is the westernmost edge of, St. Paul's province, the Catholic universe of North America, the old Catholic universe. And older still, the western edge of the Athapascan language families, which stretch all the way back as far as Hudson's Bay, really. I mean, there's dozens and dozens of languages, but in that broad, huge linguistic group. And the coast culture begins, right? And it becomes increasingly, curiously Protestant for all kinds of interesting reasons. And it is right there, the greatest and most important and most disturbing conflicts or struggles in the land claims disputes in Canada, that was the fulcrum, was right there. And of course, it ended up producing the leading case on Aboriginal title and rights in Canada.
So there you,
which is Delgamuukw versus the Queen. Yeah,
a young reporter at the Vancouver Sun, this Delgamuukw case involving the Gitxsan and
Wet'suwet'en
claim comes up, and you say, I want to go up and report this story in the style of what we used to call new journalism, like Harry Southern or some of the other greats. I mean, this really is a classic of a style of reporting, not just, that's another conversation.
Right, thanks. Yeah.
But it was momentous at the time, but it's still with us now. And it's still, this show is power struggle. It's about energy and how we get energy. To me, the passion I have for this show comes from that, because it's a human struggle, because you can't say economy without having energy in that. And humans can't persist without energy, but it's a struggle to get it. And the struggle of this area persists today.
It has been the front lines of that epochal struggle over energy as well.
And it's a place in geopolitical terms, which is a term, geopolitical, that wasn't used much for a long time until Russia invaded Ukraine. It wasn't used in Canada much. You didn't hear it.
Well, there were nerds like us who would use it a lot.
Occasionally, yes. But suddenly, when it was talking about it, and if you look at the geopolitics of Canada and its future, it goes through the lands of the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en people. And we saw that in the headlines in 2020 when the whole country was shut down because of the rail blockades. I actually was, I think, the only one who went out there to document this. We put a drone up. We interviewed people at the tracks. There was actually someone who decided they didn't like me being there and chased me off the site at Hazelton, which you write about. And it was a flashpoint then, as it was 37 years ago.
Well, it was actually we Sakes at Gitwangach who first stood on the tracks, the CN tracks, by himself. He stood there and stopped the train. And I have to confess, I'm kind of personally vested in this, in that, a lot of my buddies are in the logging industry and the fishing industry when I was growing up. But we Sakes, I loved him. He ended up being my first boy's godfather, and which required a little bit of backstairs work, because he's actually an Anglican, and we're Catholics, and so you had to do a little bit of work with the archdiocese to get that done. But he was a great guy, and a barrel of laughs. And he didn't have some kind of chip on his shoulder. He wanted to see a flourishing forest industry in his traditional territories, white guys and Indians, as we used to call them. And the great concern then was the way the wealth was being drained from the landscape, and it was being consolidated, and we were shipping, and we still are shipping raw logs off to Asia. And in more recent years, that very same fulcrum, that exact place has been where, the great struggles and the arrests and the roadblocks that some of the Wet'suwet'ens have been involved with against the natural gas pipeline that's going through there. And I think what was different then was that the whole point of the assertion of Aboriginal title among the people at the vanguard of that struggle was so that Indigenous people would have a stake, a vested stake in the development and the management of the natural resources of their traditional territories, in cooperation with and collaboration with Umshua, white people, their neighbors, and quite often their relatives. There are very few politicians who understand that that's where it all came from. It wasn't about stopping development. That was the last thing that it was about. As a matter of fact, the successful argument in Aboriginal title law was that Indigenous people have the right to, Aboriginal title implies the right of Indigenous people to exploit the natural resources of their traditional territories in a contemporary manner, and to build pipelines, to harvest timber, to develop mines as an Aboriginal right, as a right deriving from unextinguished Aboriginal title. And in recent years, it's kind of being turned on its head. And I mean, I think reasonably and for understandable cases in some instances. But that's what it was all about. And interestingly, the first use of the term reconciliation, we hear it all, reconcile, everybody wants. We're all in favor of reconciliation. We're not quite sure what that's supposed to mean. And as far as I understand, as far as I know, the term reconciliation in law was established in Delgamuukw. And the point of reconciliation was it was to reconcile Aboriginal rights with Crown title, Aboriginal title with Crown sovereignty. And it has become something else. And I think it's become quite gnarly and debris strewn and contested and not particularly healthy.
It feels like one of those terms. I've seen sustainability go through this, and it's owned by so-and-so, and then so-and-so wants to get a hold of it, and it changes. And at the end of the day, it becomes kind of useless, and we need to think of something else if we want to put meaning into it. But you know, in this whole campaign, looking back over 6 weeks, which we're going to do here, and maybe talk about the campaign that wasn't, that should have been. I can't help but think, I was reading the Globe and Mail, I think, had an editorial that said, look, this country needs energy. We need energy security. We need it to be environmentally acceptable to the populace. We need it to be available and affordable. It needs to drive the industrial development and the economy. We definitely need that. To have that, we can't just say we need energy. We have to admit we need things like pipelines and infrastructure. Otherwise, you're just mouthing meaningless
Platitudes.
nonsense. Yes. And so they came down, they said, look, we don't think Carney's convincing in what he's offering to get that. But you know what? If you're expecting us to say we think Poilievre can do it, don't, because we don't think he's offered the way to get there. Neither one has offered, even though both acknowledge that yes, it's true, we do need to solve this. We do need that development. Neither one has persuaded the anonymous, the collective voice of the Globe and Mail that it's there. So there are those for whom where we are today, wherever that is unresolved. Yeah. So we have a job to do here, Terry. Let's resolve this. Let's explain it.
The contradictions that prevail globally now, I think, were front and center to the land struggles and the resource development struggles that obtained when we were boy reporters up there. And I mean serious contradictions, and they are broadly geopolitical. When you find yourself barely able to make ends meet, and you live in Smithers, and you go to Costco or Walmart, and you buy pink salmon that's packaged, that was actually fished out of the river that you can see from the parking lot, and was sent to China, and was packaged there, and then comes all the way back across the Pacific, and you're buying it under plastic. I mean, this strikes me as an odd way to run an economy, a resource economy, and I think energy sovereignty, I think, is the conversation that we really should have been having through the election. To some extent, I think we were having it. But the overemphasis on pipelines for their own sake misses the point that, well, we actually have pipelines. And the pipeline, what is it, $34 billion, I think, we shelled out
Trans Mountain
to get the Trans Mountain pipeline built. Where's that oil going?
California and China.
It's going to China in a very, very big way. Our exports to China have been increasing through all of the fighting about the two Michaels and Chinese Beijing's influence operations in Canada. The trade deficit is still outrageous, but exports have been increasing, and it's mainly oil and coal. And this is something that I think really complicates the whole question about Canada's obligations with respect to climate change, which I'm all in favor of us meeting. But, imposing a carbon tax, making some bloke in Prince George pay more at the gas pump, if you actually look at we don't call it global climate change for nothing. It's not like Canada's making any great contribution to the flooding of greenhouse gases into the upper stratosphere in the bigger scheme of things. And when you look at that bigger scheme of things, there's a chart you can find that's being put together by the oil industry and by environmental organizations. It's one of the few confluences of interest that they're agreed on. Is the contribution of greenhouse gases, production of greenhouse gases since the year 2000. And in fact, North America and Europe and Japan, it's basically a flat line. There've been all kinds of innovations that, the way we manufacture cars, for one thing, that have allowed us to basically more or less level off our greenhouse gas emissions, whereas the Chinese contribution is like that. The line is like that. And you can't pretend that that's not happening, and you can't expect ordinary working people to bear this burden when we have senior politicians that are flitting off to China and patting the Chinese on the back for building perhaps less coal mines this year than they did last year, and what have you, and not having the same commitments, whether they're realistic or not, to net zero as we do. This is really quite huge. This is a really huge issue, and it's very difficult in Canada to have an honest conversation about it.
I'm struck by the success China has had in becoming a manufacturer at a mega scale of the components of what some call energy transition, although that term I think would be better replaced with what's actually happening, energy addition. We're just adding more energy, but let's call it energy transition equipment, solar panels and wind cells, nacelles, and hydrogen electrolyzers, and the whole gamut. China has become the dominant supplier of all of that equipment. And if you want to have a green economy in the definition of the renewables lobby, you are going to be getting your equipment from China, where incidentally it's made with coal-fired electricity. But let's set that aside.
And as often as not, the photovoltaic function of it all is produced in Xinjiang by Uyghur slaves.
Such as the rare earth minerals that need to be supplied and all of these things. It's riven with contradictions of this kind. And yet there seems to be the expectation that there's a moral issue here. There's the right and wrong. If you don't accept that we have to buy these components from China for the Western green transition, then you must be a climate denier, is one of the statements you sometimes hear. Another is the Trumpian side of we're going to punish China for committing the crime of selling us the things that we've been demanding China sell us for the last 50 years. And they have accumulated the money we gave them when they should have been buying the things we wanted to sell them. So now we've got this Trumpian thing. You called the Trump incoming cabinet, this is back in November before it even came true, you said the Trump administration would be a cabinet of, quote, circus freaks and Bond villains, and you're not wrong.
Turns out.
So when you look at what Trump has built and you look at his relationship with China, is he doing something different than Canada is? Well, clearly he is. Is he doing something maybe better?
Okay, that's a good question. All right, let me say, I think Trump's tariffs on China doesn't hurt my feelings. Doesn't make me cry. I just wish we had been doing this a quarter of a century ago or more. The problem is that he's making war on the rest of the world, including the liberal democratic order, while he's also pretending to make war on China. And I say pretending is that if you actually look at his polemics and postures and standpoints and policies, Xi Jinping isn't bothered by any of this. He's described Xi Jinping as his friend. He really likes Xi Jinping. His vision, to the extent that there is one there, is to kind of divide up the planet between China, Russia, and Washington, D.C. And, China is basically basically owns Africa now. And what is it, 7 of the 11 major United Nations agencies are directly or indirectly controlled by China now. And that's largely because of the UN's retreat from the world under the Obama administration, by the way, and the Biden administration. It wasn't all Trump. But the Chinese are looking at this now and saying, meh, 14% of their exports, 14.5% of their exports goes to the United States. Command and control slave economy. You don't think that those guys can figure out what to do? Of course they can figure it out. They're going to be fine. And I look back to the beginning of this century. You know, we all think of September 11th, 2001, right? I think it was kind of like a blunt trauma wound to the head. Everybody was shaken by this, on the left and the right. I will not disparage George W. Bush, as so many people will. I think if you can't imagine what the world would have been like if we allowed Saddam Hussein to stay in power. I mean, give your head a shake. Guy had to be gone. And which was, by the way, the position of the Democratic Party long before George Bush came along. Ironically, one of the things we forget. But the bigger thing that happened last year was in December, and it was when the World Trade Organization was permitted to admit China into its ranks. That was the moment that the West put a knife to its own throat. And that has determined largely the course of history ever since. And it is why Russia has been allowed to get away with the genocidal invasion of Ukraine. And it is why our economy has become weakened and why our politics are enfeebled. And why Canada is at this juncture now where we're being pulled between the orbits of two very dark stars. One is impermanent. Trump isn't going to be there forever. But I think, inshallah, God willing, we have learned that we cannot be as reliant as we have been on trade with the United States. Our economy should not be as reliant as it has become on exports either, and Beijing and that dark star. And those guys aren't going away anytime soon.
So are we headed towards a stronger reliance on China?
That's my worry. That's my worry. That's a far greater worry that I have than this difficulty that we're having with the Yanks. We're always going to have difficulties with the Yanks. They're a bit mad. And it's really quite tragic. I remember saying to a lot of my erstwhile comrades on the left, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, you might whine about American imperialism as much as you like, but you're going to miss the old bitch when she's gone. And that is what we're seeing now, is we're seeing the collapse of the final collapse of the American order. It began under Obama in a very, very, very big way. His capitulations throughout the Middle East, and the retreat of democracy around the world, where it's measured by Freedom House and VDEM and any number of institutions that track this sort of thing. I think we're in our 19th year now, depending on how you add it up, 18 or 19 years of democracy's retreat throughout the world.
Terry, you've written that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was basically already acting like a governor when Trump started calling him Governor
That was
Trudeau.
a paradox. Yeah.
Why did you think that?
Because all the evidence suggested that, I mean, he was indistinguishable from a governor of some small, irrelevant, but seriously woke democratic state. You know, you have a mass shooting in Uvalde, Texas, and the next thing you know, he's having this big press conference and announcing how he's going to impose further restrictions on firearms in Canada. There's a leak out of the U.S. Supreme Court about the pending decision on abortion rights. He has another big press conference and makes commitments to ensure that Canadians have full access to abortions. I don't think there was a single faddish imbecility to come out of an American, an Ivy League university's social sciences and humanities department that wasn't adopted by the Trudeau government. Canada was like some kind of social justice Instagram account in charge of a G7 country. I mean, it really was comical. And all of his influences, almost all of his influences were American, Trudeau's. And the other thing that I've always found fascinating about that, I mean, Trumpism is definitely a dear leader cult. I mean, let's be honest about this, for God's sake. Well, so was Trudeauism, very much so. They're both one percenters. Everything, if you could look at all of the most extreme and even crazy things that people were saying about Trump's liaisons with Vladimir Putin's regime in Russia, in Trump 1, and a lot of it was crazy, okay, are things that can be said accurately about Justin Trudeau's relationship with Xi Jinping's regime in Beijing. If you can imagine Trump elevating the head of the Russian-American Business Council to the most senior position in the Senate immediately after getting elected. That's what Trudeau did. He elevated the head of the China-Canada Business Council to the senior government post in the Senate. If you can imagine Trump assembling all of the key Republican donors in various cash for access soirees across the United States with Russian oligarchs, that's exactly what Justin Trudeau did with Chinese billionaires. If you can imagine Trump getting elected and immediately sending a delegation to Moscow to open up negotiations for a free trade agreement between Russia and the United States, that's exactly what Trudeau did with respect to his hopes for a free trade agreement in China, with China. So,
yeah. Well, yeah. Can you imagine if Donald Trump did a podcast that was in Canada? Because I've noticed that whether it's Trudeau or Carney and Poilievre, it seems like the only podcasts they do are in the U.S. And early in the campaign, I think someone from the Carney camp, I know someone from the Carney camp, asked me, hey, would you be interested in having Mark Carney on the Power Struggle podcast? I sure, absolutely, I would do that. I'd never heard anything, but then you start showing up on the U.S. podcast. I don't know, what am I?
Well, feels a
little colonial.
He basically announced his decision to run for the leadership of the Liberal Party on Jon Stewart's show in New York, right? Similarly, I mean, Trudeau, he shows up, the first major interview he did was with the New York Times when he was describing how he...
So we're already the 51st state.
Certainly acting like it. I mean, so I think it's not... There's a lot of observations about how the fringes of the Conservative Party, and I will call them fringes, do very, very closely resemble some of the Trumpist hooliganism, the yahoos. That's true. But let's be honest about this, shall we, is all I'm saying.
Well, let's get into this election campaign.
Okay.
Did China manipulate this campaign? Is there evidence concerned?
Yeah, there's a lot of evidence for that. It's just that the difficulty is in the language that we use. How is it foreign interference? Is it foreign interference if it's welcomed and invited, if it's solicited? Is that interference? If you pull over at the side of the road because you need a flat tire, you've got a flat tire, and somebody comes by and fixes your flat tire, is he interfering with your car? It is welcomed and invited. There are at least 15 ridings in Canada where it's practically impossible to get elected dog catcher without the approval of the local proxies of the United Front Work Department of the Chinese Communist Party Politburo. It is deeply vested in the leadership of the Liberal Party in the Greater Toronto area, parts of Metro Vancouver. The Conservative Party is not immune to this either. They've been very active in monkey-wrenching the Conservative Party as well. Nowhere near as successfully as with the Liberal Party, because, of course, in the case of the Liberal Party, particularly the Justin Trudeau Liberals, although Chrétien Liberals as well, the Liberal Party essentially became the political wing of the Canada-China Business Council. And in the person of Pierre Trudeau, you had a person who objectively, whatever you might think of him, like him or not, could be described as the most important propaganda asset of the Chinese Communist Party in North America in the 1960s and 1970s.
Now,
it's bred in the bone with these guys, is what I'm saying.
Now, maybe just to be devil's advocate for China, just a couple of things I want to throw at you, Terry. okay, look, the current prime minister, as we sit here, is someone who was the governor of the Bank of England. He is someone who stood up when Keir Starmer was trying to lead the Labour Party into power and did so successfully. He stood up, Mark Carney did, on video and endorsed Keir Starmer's government. And presumably there's some friendship or alliance there that persists. We thought we stopped being a colony of the United Kingdom a long, long time ago, but it seems like one might be able to say, well, there's a pretty strong alliance. Is that command and control? Is there something in that? Surely a critic of your China arguments might suggest that. And I wonder what you have to say about that.
Well, I mean, personally, it's difficult for me because I'm a Taig. I come from Fenian stock. I'm Irish Catholic, but we were also loyalists. We're Darcy McGee Catholics, okay? And we have a very deep commitment to a kind of an anti-fascist, anti-Nazi tradition on both sides of my mother's and father's sides. I have no difficulty in saying God save the king. I have no difficulty in saying that at all. I think the Commonwealth was a good idea. It didn't work out all that well. A lot of people are, reviving the notion of a Canada, Australia, New Zealand, United Kingdom kind of alliance. That's an interesting conversation to have. It doesn't mean being subject to some kind of imperial overseer. In fact, relations with the United States doesn't have to mean that either. But you'd have to kid yourself very, very, very long and hard if you won't acknowledge that that's the kind of relationship that we would enter into and have entered into. The deeper that we associate with China, the closer that we hitch our wagon to that team of horses, the more subservient we will become, the more vulnerable and susceptible we will become to the whims of the world's most successful and dynamic torture state. I mean, it is a matter of values ultimately, I think. And I make no apologies for adhering to the values of my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents. Yeah. There's nothing wrong with shooting Nazis.
Well, King Charles is our king, and we are a part of the Commonwealth.
Yeah.
There's a lot of commonality there. But I am still curious. I mean, there will be, say, Chinese Canadians who are thinking, well, I immigrated from this country. I would like to use my cultural ties to China to be successful in business and in manufacturing. But now we have these divisions. Yeah.
That's my answer. Maybe it's because I run with a rough crowd, okay? Maybe it's the company I keep. I've spent more time in synagogues than Catholic churches over the last 15 years. The people that I associate with, I mean, I'm barred from Russia. I can no longer go anywhere near Russia. I'm sanctioned by Russia. Not officially sanctioned by China yet, but I know I'll never be able to return to China. All of the people I know, the Chinese that I know, the Hong Kongers that I know, don't have the view that you just expressed. They want rid and shut of the influence of the Chinese Communist Party in their lives and in their country. And you have to, I think you really have to choose sides sometimes. It does come down to that. And it's complicated because, we talk about the Chinese community. There's no such thing as the Chinese community in Canada. There used to be something that you could call the Chinese community in Canada. They were Cantonese-speaking people, Taishan and Taishanese people, most of them from the 5 counties at the mouth of the Pearl River Delta, the Hong Kongers and so on. And about 10 years ago, that started to change radically. I think Vancouver had about 100,000 people, if you include the family members as well, and all the capital that they brought to Greater Vancouver. And you have significant candidates in the Liberal Party today who made enormous profits during that period, bringing Chinese investors over and flying them around Metro Vancouver in helicopters. And the enormous investment in real estate, if you want to talk about house prices, which I think we should talk about. And And you have Mandarin is now the second language of the people that we describe as Chinese in Canada. It's not Cantonese anymore. So you have this strange phenomenon of immense wealth that has migrated to Canada, and these huge investments in real estate and in property bolt holes, and an influx of a population that is extremely wealthy, Mandarin speaking, aligned with the Chinese Communist Party, and embedded at every single level of the Liberal Party in the GTA. You've got Mary Ng, you've got, the people who, Han Dong. I mean, that was just some curious little hilarious side angle, right? I mean, the story there that I think everybody misses, that Justin Trudeau knew very well that Han Dong was mobbed up from the very beginning. He knew that riding election was monkey wrenched and rigged. He was told that by CSIS in the days before the election. I know that they knew because when Han Dong was running for the leadership, was running for the ticket in Don Valley North, I told Gerald Butts personally. Gerald and I used to be almost kind of chummy. They knew. And that's the thing that I think we miss in this, is that they knew, they know, and they see nothing wrong with it. Okay? People have to get their heads around it. The overwhelming majority of Canadians might recoil in disgust and revulsion and think, oh my God, the Chinese are interfering with our elections and so on. The people involved in these ridings and the people involved in the Liberal establishment see nothing wrong with it. And once you get that into your head, everything starts to make sense. And I mean, so it's very subjective. I see something wrong with it. I make no...
Well, suppose that whoever the Prime Minister was said, I'm going to call that Glavin and ask him to stop just criticizing me and tell me what I should do about it.
That's a tough one.
Get that call. What are you going to say, Terry? Because you've been banging on about this for a time. Here's your chance.
Well, I think, things have changed with the whole American business, right? With Trump has completely, detonated what we used to call the liberal rules-based international order. But I think the emphasis has got to be on, I am very, very reluctant to propose policy remedies or predict the future. But to the extent that I am inclined to a certain direction, it would be energy sovereignty, for sure. A far greater emphasis on interprovincial trade, a far greater emphasis on stability and security. I'm not proposing conscription, but it sure would be great if we had a massive investment in the Canadian reserves, which would address a lot of youth unemployment, for one thing, and it would mobilize people, particularly young people. And this is the election campaign that we don't talk about. This is what happened. The thing for me, if you can sort of separate it into a domestic issue, which is really hard to do, because all of these things have international implications, is the bottom third of the Canadian population. Most of them are kids. The people that we call the lost generation. What we have done to working class people, working class kids in this country. That's a hill I would die on. And it is, we pretend that we can build our way out of it. We can't build our way out of it. It's impossible. And it won't happen. If you think that building is going to do anything for house prices, then explain Vancouver to me. Since the 1970s, there's tripled the number of residential units within the city limits of Vancouver. Should be the cheapest city in North America. It's the most expensive. If you don't factor in the speculative value in land, and if you don't understand the dynamics of a tulip bulb mania, we have tens of thousands of empty apartments and condos in this country. We've already got it, all right? It's not like we haven't been building. But at the same time, we have outsourced our immigration policy. We've run immigration policy as a series of rackets. by strip mall colleges and by high-end universities and by immigration consultants and by provincial governments. There's a dizzying array of categories that we rely on. It's got to the point where the immigration, the immigration department stats and Statistics Canada, the numbers don't add up. Nobody knows how many people live in Canada. I'll put it that way. It's the easiest way to put it. Nobody knows. Nobody knows how many temporary permit holders live in this country. We know that at least 500,000, their permits have expired and they're out there somewhere. And then there's the official federal guess is 50 to 500,000 Canadians who are working, or people who are working illegally in Canada. Meanwhile, we brought more than 1 million people into the country every year for the last 3.5 years. We don't have enough houses to go around. We don't have enough jobs to go around. And if anybody thinks we can just add a bunch of houses, it's just not going to happen. Even if both the Liberals and the Conservatives were magically correct in their projections of how many houses they're capable of building, if we're really, really lucky, after all that construction, 10 years from now, we would be in the same situation we're in now. And we're not being honest about this.
So we don't make anything. We don't make the goods we consume. We don't make babies. We have to import those too. And
one of the big lies,
our industries, we have to import that. What do we make here?
Well, one of the big lies I think that's really upsetting is, well, of course, these kids these days, they're just lazy and they just play video games and they don't want to have babies. So of course we have to invite all these hard workers to come and do their jobs. The cause and effect lines there are completely wrong. It's not like young people don't want to have families. How do you raise a family in a 700 square foot box on the 8th floor in downtown Victoria here, or Toronto, or Vancouver? How many kids are you going to be able to fit into that? And you can't afford to buy it anyway. So I think a lot of this is about culture. The political economy and politics tends to be downstream of culture. And I kind of like it when Poilievre talks about the Department of Defense and he says, we need to build a warrior culture. Okay, let's do that, right? But I really think that we need to be honest about the dystopian culture that we have built for millions and millions of young Canadians. This is unforgivable. And we're seeing a lot of the result of that in the, 50,000 fentanyl deaths. And that's stuff that, to be fair, the kind of radical remedies that would be required to actually deal with this stuff, I don't think either the Liberals or the Conservatives are willing to say how bad it is. You don't get elected to office by saying, man, things are so bad, I haven't the faintest idea how we could get out of them.
Well, one might say, hey, boomers, you're going to die anyways. Why don't we, and you'll give up your wealth when that happens. Why don't we just speed up the giving up the wealth part of that and redistribute that? Do you think that would be...
Well, there are ways to do it. There are ways to do it. Taxing the unearned increment on property at point of sale in order to, at least help suppress the exponential growth in property values, and also to fund a little bit of housing. I mean, I just get a kick out of it. You read it every day, isn't this wonderful, 700 unit housing has been approved, and it only took 18 months instead of 3 years to get all the approvals done. And 60 of the units are going to be affordable. Excuse me? Why are we building anything that isn't affordable? And if we can't afford to build affordable housing, then we have to have a conversation about why we can't afford to build affordable housing.
Well, in the lead up to the election and during, the most popular chart amongst the business crowd was the one that shows the gap between the U.S. and Canada in GDP terms over the last 10 years. It's kind of chugging away like this, and then boom, it's just widened right out. And that is the original sin in the view of those who believe that if you can grow the distribution of wealth through growth of the GDP, through the gross domestic product, that's how you have American-style lifestyles, because we don't have that. You can buy a house in the States, even
Yep.
in a lot of the bigger cities, if you're not a high-wage earner.
Yep. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think if you look at GDP per capita, that's the thing. I don't know if there was anybody in the Liberal Party who just said, you know what, if we just sort of opened the floodgate and basically, invited people to come to Canada by the hundreds of thousands, millions, that would actually expand the numbers on GDP and it would make us look good. I don't know. I don't know what they were thinking. One of the enduring mysteries of the Trudeau government, the Trudeau era, the past 10 years. How much of this happened deliberately and how much was it by mistake?
What do you think?
I don't know. Half the time I really don't know. But one of the things that I think the most crippling blow among many to Canada's cultural resilience, it was the lowering of the flags on Parliament Hill, on all federal buildings across the country, in that year-long national psychotic episode following the discovery of a mass grave that was never discovered, that was animated largely by the federal government, and Indigenous people were kind of encouraged to play along. Didn't lead that, by the way. Didn't lead that whole thing. They were pushed into positions of leadership. And essentially, whatever crazy things an Indigenous person might have said about mass graves, well, they watch the CBC like the rest of us, don't they? I think that was more damaging, than anything else. Because we really did need to believe in ourselves in order to...
Is that what fed the Canada is broken belief? Because I think there is a strong belief for a
70% of Canadians, I think it was 70% last year, said yes, Canada's broken. So it's not just some snappy conservative slogan. This is what Canadians actually had come to believe. And one of the interesting things I think about the election campaign is it occurred, and it was weird how Carney became kind of associated with elbows up and without, defending Canadian sovereignty. But there was going to be a backlash. There's all this pent up, suppressed Canadian patriotism, right? That had really been beaten out of us for a decade by the Trudeau government. And there was bound to be a significant backlash to that. And it happened. I mean, you got to remember, the Liberals wanted Trudeau gone. I mean, he didn't have the support of his own caucus. Everyone wanted to see the back of that guy as soon as possible. And I think Trudeau, Carney has really tried to disingenuously or not, deliberately and immediately attempted to distance himself from that kind of polemic about Canada. I mean, he started talking about, our great English and French traditions and how we're the largest European country outside of Europe or whatever it was, and wasn't afraid to be seen in the company of monarchists and so on. So it was going to happen, I think. It was going to happen anyway. No matter what Trump did or said, no matter if Kamala Harris had won, we would still be stuck with these deep economic dysfunctions in Canada. And we would still have been at a point where Canadians were beginning to say, well, wait a minute, I'm actually not ashamed to be a Canadian. So all of these strange things combined at once to produce the election that we just had.
You've warned that the path ahead might be darker. What did you mean by that?
Well, I've always been notoriously optimistic. And one of the things that still leaves me hope for optimism is we don't have the faintest idea what's going to happen tomorrow. I mean, I was reading this study the other day where economists failed to predict 148 of the last 152 recessions, I think it was. So, okay, economists, I love you guys, but give me a break. You don't know what's going to happen any more than I do. And also, journalists are terrible soothsayers and fortune tellers. So I don't know what to say. But one of the things that I do take heart in is the fact that nobody saw the Berlin Wall falling, Nobody saw that coming. CIA did not see it coming, this collapse of communism. Didn't see it. The Arab Spring, nobody saw it coming. Nobody saw it coming. And so the world can turn, right? No one knows the hour of the night. No one knows the lash to the back of the slave that will cause him to rise up against his master. So I live in hope. And I don't mean to be dreary, but I do think that we are not fully comprehending the precariousness of our situation as a free country. We're not fully grappling with the economic dislocation that so many Canadians are facing, just living paycheck to paycheck, barely being able to make ends meet. And indeed, having been sort of lured into the idea that you can invest in property rather than anything productive, God forbid. You can just buy some property. And now you've got tens of thousands of sort of mom and pop investors across the country that are walking away from their condo investments because they'll never get a return on it because people simply can't afford to buy them. And people don't want to live in 700 square foot boxes on there. And the remedy that both parties are proposing, to build a kind of a Leninplatz on top of all of these cities in Canada, I don't think people are going to put up with it. And I don't think it's going to work either.
Where Ottawa sends out the plans, here you go, you can build this in Edmonton or Toronto.
It's a very open and very real question, and a frightening one is, does the future belong to China? I don't know the answer to that question.
Well, it's tended in that direction, and they're willing it to be so through the things they're doing. They have power and money, and Trump is doing them a huge favor by getting you off the playing field in Africa and all over the world. So it seems like the next century is going to be China's.
It's quite possible that the coming century is China's century. It's quite possible. But as I say, you never know. Every once in a while, there's a wobble in China, which is very interesting. I mean, the degree to which they've invested in surveillance and artificial intelligence to control the population. Chinese are not doing as well as you'd imagine, right? And if you question anything, you'll be disappeared. You could be the most senior economist with a think tank in Beijing that's intimately connected with the Poilievre of the Chinese Communist Party. And if you say the wrong thing, that's the last anyone will hear from you.
You could be a Politburo member, and you could take him out on live television.
Yep.
Marched out.
Yep. So I don't know. And I think there's a certain kind of emancipation in being able to say, I don't know. I don't know. And nobody really does know. So I think you need to just do the right thing. And we need to take care of each other. We need to build for ourselves. We need to be consuming our own energy first before we think about exporting it. We need to, if we're going to play a useful role internationally on the energy file, why in God's name are we not supplying Europe with natural gas? What the hell is that about? And I would say I'm kind of a China hawk, I confess, right? Kind of sounds like it anyway, right? I don't have any objection really to selling too much LNG to China. If it can wean them off coal and oil, okay, that's a transitional thing, whatever. And maybe there aren't enough buyers in the Pacific for our LNG. I don't even know that. I suspect there probably are. But the very idea that we've allowed Europe to sort of languish and to be so reliant on the Beijing satrapy there in Moscow, it really is quite astonishing that we haven't been able to marshal the will and the resources to say, damn it, we're gonna supply Europe with LNG. We're gonna be their guys.
So Terry, there's a word I've been hearing for the last 6 weeks a lot. I don't even know what it means when I hear it from different people. That word is diversification. And I mean in trade terms. Mm-hmm. I mean, because the U.S. is not seemingly going to be a reliable trading partner, at least for 4 years. We need to diversify. But some people take that to mean one thing and others take it to mean another. What do you think it means?
Well, what I would like it to mean is a trade policy that affirms and restores and rebuilds our relationships with liberal democracies. That's what I would hope it would mean. And it's odd. It's a very odd thing that for the last few years we've had, Rosemary Ng or Mary Ng as our international trade minister. It's funny how that works, eh? I mean, international trade, nobody talks about her. Like it was supposed to be her job. I don't think that there's anyone who would deny the proposition that we are simply too reliant on the United States. We expect too much of them. I'm not particularly persuaded of, the security umbrella argument and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, okay. But that's the way the Americans wanted it, okay? That was the role that the Europeans and Canadians were expected to play in the post, Breton Accords and NATO arrangements were to buy American weapons if we're going to buy any weapons at all, but basically be the kind of ladies' auxiliary down at the Legion Hall. That was our role. And then too many countries became comfortable in that role. And then the Americans said, well, we don't want you to play it anymore. But it was the Americans of being the beneficiary of these arrangements. Let's not kid ourselves. That's the way they wanted it. And so how do you go about, remember we were talking about friend shoring for a while. Remember that term was kind of fancy. I guess it was Janet Yellen, who was the Commerce Secretary, I think, and Chrystia Freeland, who I, by the way, have a lot of regard for Chrystia Freeland, whatever her economic stuff.
Bring manufacturing from countries we don't expect.
Yeah, she was good on Ukraine. She was good on China. She was good on Venezuela. I'm sorry, she was about as good as it got. And she was very much a proponent of this proposition that we should be emphasizing trade with fellow democracies and, giving fellow democracies a leg up and allowing fellow democracies to do us a favor from time to time. I would hope that is the kind of diversification in trade that we pursue. Because if all we're doing is, the whole Harold Innis thesis about Canada is basically the hewers of wood and drawers of water. Can we get out of that now, please?
Please, about time, yeah.
I mean, there's all kinds of reasons to develop our rare earth industries in Canada for our own purposes, not just to sell them, right? Let's have an energy corridor in Canada. But let's emphasize a corridor that's actually through Canada instead of partly through the United States. Let's get LNG to Europe. Why don't we build stuff? I'm not proposing some massive, 5-year plan, kind of Warsaw Pact building project. But to the extent that we're building anything in this country, let's build it for ourselves. And I do think that the one thing that I think is something you can take to the bank, the one thing that I think that no matter what happens next week or next month or next year, we need to be taking care of each other. We need to hunker down. It's going to be weird. It's going to be very strange. We don't know where things are going with China. It could implode in a year. We don't know where things are going with the United States. If we think the Democratic Party is our friend, okay. If you say so, the war in Ukraine, what's happening in Africa, the genocide in Darfur, what's happening in Sudan alone is just off the charts compared to anything that we've seen in recent years here. We need to take care of each other. We need to hunker down, and we need to be very, very clear about who our friends are and who we can't particularly rely on. And we cannot be all things to all people. We have to build on our strengths, and our strengths do lie in natural resources, not only But we need to build stuff, feed ourselves, even clothe ourselves. We have to start thinking about that kind of thing. Not being so reliant on trade in the first place.
Well, Terry Glavin, that's an almost superhuman task.
Yeah.
Whoever is going to carry it forward needs to succeed for Canada. So let's hope that your thoughts have provided some timely, salutary advice for that. So thanks for joining me at Power Struggle today.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I hope I made some use of myself in some way.
I think you have.